Welcome to the Education Insights Focus on Behavior podcast. We're here to talk about all things behavior in the world of education. We take the science of behavior and break it down for educators into easily implementable steps, and we're excited to spend some time with you. Get ready to talk through behavior, what works, what doesn't work, and how we can all improve our work in schools so we as educators can be more fulfilled and our students can be more successful.
Welcome to Education Insights Focus on Behavior. I'm your host, Dr. Selena Layden, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Daniel Irwin. Hey, Daniel.
Hello.
And Dr. Daria Lorio-Barston. Hey, Daria.
Hi, everyone.
And as always, our producer, Emily Muse. Hi, Emily.
Hello there.
All right, Daniel's got some fun facts for us to start off the day with.
I do have some fun facts, and they're about triangles. And I think we all know that the sum of all the angles of a triangle add up to 180. But what we also know is that the triangle is the simplest, and we know in our hearts, but we may not know it in word, that the triangle is the simplest and smallest polygon possible, as it takes a minimum of 3 straight sides to enclose a space. Also, the isosceles, the word isosceles, comes from the Greek words isos, which means equal, and skelos, happy Halloween, which means leg, referring to the 2 equal sides. It's also the strongest and most rigid of all the shapes, which is why we see it in engineering.
That's
feats.
why 3-legged stools never wobble. Did you know that? If you have 3 legs, the chair will not wobble.
What if one leg is shorter?
It doesn't matter.
It'll
'cause
just
it's
be a
only
crooked
3.
chair.
You might be
'Cause it has
crooked
to-
on it, but it will not wobble.
Huh. I learn something new every day.
Also,
But
when you're rock climbing, you're supposed to try as much as you can to keep 3 points of contact onto the rocks.
It makes sense. So speaking of triangles, if you were thinking of a triangle, what is the first triangle that comes to your mind? Like, what's the most iconic triangle that comes to your mind? Daniel, do you have one?
Bermuda.
Oh, that's cheating. It's
It's
not an
iconic.
actual triangle.
It came to mind.
All right.
It is an actual triangle.
Is it?
And you don't hear much about it anymore. I mean, I feel like it was there. It was ever present. I feel like in elementary school, people talked about the Bermuda Triangle all the time. Now you
Kinda
don't
like
hear anything about
quicksand,
it. I like quicksand, indeed.
right? Like as a kid, like you felt like you probably need to be worried about this a lot. And as an adult, I have yet to actually come in contact with any quicksand in my life.
Or weird things with the Bermuda
Well, I was going to
Triangle.
say I actually have been to Bermuda, but not the weirdness of the Bermuda Triangle.
Fun fact, do you know why people no longer talk about the Bermuda Triangles at elementary school?
Because it's not really a thing.
No, because now they talk about MTSS triangles instead.
Oh, there's a lot of
Watch
triangles.
out.
So, Selena, what's the topic of our today's episode?
Well, I can't imagine, but it clearly must be about the MTSS triangles. No, it is about MTSS today, which I think a lot of educators are pretty familiar with, at least a basic framework of what the MTSS model is. So multi-tiered systems of support, MTSS, is a pretty common framework. And even if you don't have a formal MTSS process or system in place, you probably have at least pieces of it when you consider things like tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 interventions, or kind of foundational interventions, more intensive interventions, highly intensive interventions, however you kind of want to talk about it. But there is a triangle that goes along with MTSS. And Daria, I don't know if you want to spend a little time talking about that.
Yeah, well, so what I was going to add is I think I would anticipate that a lot of our listeners are probably very familiar with PBIS, the Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports, which is one leg, just like the tri-legged stool, one leg of the MTSS framework overall. The system itself is intended to combine the academic aspect, the behavioral aspect, the emotional, the social aspect, and kind of weave them all together. And the premise, what you touched upon, Selena, is that you want to make sure that you're providing the supports for students that they need. So tier 1 is your universal supports, right, where everybody is getting your solid evidence-based instruction, whether it's academic, whether it is behavioral, but everybody access it. Then some friends require a bit more support. And so those friends, in addition to tier 1, receive tier 2 support. So that might look like additional small group instruction or additional supports, interventions, remediations, those kind of things. And then in addition to that, we have some other friends who really require more intensive support, and that's the tier three, right? So ideally, what should be happening is that the framework should look like a triangle with your first tier being the base, being the largest because everybody gets it, and then the tier two and tier three is laid on top of it. So like a tiered cake, not to replace it. Um, and then it tapers off because tier three really should include supports for around 5% of students because they're really intended to be individualized or intensive. And that's the model when all things are happening to fidelity. That's what we are kind of looking for. However, I think sometimes what we see in schools are fewer triangles and more of tornadoes or the flipped triangles where it appears that a lot of our students really require very intensive supports.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to mention that students are not tiered, their needs are tiered. And what I mean by that is you don't have a tier three student, you have a student receiving tier three supports in a specific area because students may need tier two or tier three supports in mathematical calculation. They might need tier two or tier three supports in reading comprehension or social emotional learning around a particular area or in behavior around a particular need, but they aren't classified. The entirety of the student is not tier two or tier three. Tier one supports may be perfectly appropriate and all they need for other areas. And I think that can be confusing for people sometimes.
Selena, thanks for that clarification because I do think sometimes folks try to use almost like a shorthand way of talking in schools. And sometimes we do forget that and we end up categorizing kids as opposed to their needs. So that's a great point to bring up.
So I think what I'd like to talk about today is how the science of behavior folds into MTSS and what does that kind of look like. And so maybe if we start with tier one, which is universal supports, what does the science of behavior have to do or have to contribute to those tier one universal interventions?
I think one of the most important pieces of that is really operationalizing what we're looking for from both teachers and staff as well as students. So that tier one looks at if we're thinking about behavioral expectations, we're laying out, and a lot of schools have an acrostic or whatever it is, pause for, now forgetting the words that pause would make up, but polite and academic, whatever. Be safe, be kind, and be responsible are a good three to start with. And kids don't have necessarily a great understanding of what it is to be safe, be kind, be responsible. Um, and so we look to the teachers to start helping them build that framework of understanding of what it means to be safe. And so we're finding those specific behaviors that kids are doing and then label them as safe and as the thing they should be doing. We're finding those opportunities to label responsible behaviors and building that language and helping students tie and associate specific behaviors with what those expectations are so that we're seeing more and more of those things, more and more of those behaviors happening because we're reinforcing them systematically. And that takes a shared understanding among teachers. And so I think, and all school staff. And so when we think about from a behavior analysis standpoint, we've got to be able to give teachers some flexibility, but also have a shared understanding and a shared operational definition of what these behaviors are that fit sort of under those expectations and an understanding of reinforcement and how we're encouraging and helping students do those things more often.
Yeah, and I think the other piece with tier one is having, so definitely operationalizing things so everyone has shared understanding, but also just those really solid evidence-based practices, right? Reinforcement being one of them, behavior-specific praise is one of them. And there's not necessarily, like, unfortunately, the interventions don't neatly fit into each of the tiers because it has more to do with how they're applied, but you have to have strong interventions in place.
And there are also universal classroom practices, right?
Absolutely.
And so if I can jump in and kind of chat about those for a second, I want to make sure that we are all have a common understanding that the principles of behavior are embedded throughout all five of them. So whether we use the technical language or whether we use more kindergarten, student-friendly language, the principles are there. And so the idea is if you are implementing the classroom universal practices to fidelity, then you are less likely to have students who require more intensive supports in tier two or in tier three. And so the expectations and rules that Daniel mentioned is one practice, right? Making sure that kids are clear, that we have taught those rules, that we have reinforced those rules. And better yet, I prefer the language of community agreements rather than rules, because then you are building a supportive learning community as opposed to I get to dictate what my classroom looks like. Instead, we kind of say this is a shared space, but that's a conversation for for another time. Selena, you mentioned reinforcement, which is embedded specifically within responding, no, not responding, acknowledging behavior that you want to see in the classroom that's beneficial and conducive to learning, right? And then there are three other ones, and most of them are proactive, preventative, creating that space where everybody can be successful. So, one is maximize structure, just making sure that things make sense where they are located and where kids are supposed to be and how they're supposed to interact. The other one is focusing on student engagement to make sure that kids are more focused on their learning and they are authentically engaged in that. And then the last one is the responding to behavior that's interfering with their own learning or the learning of others, right? So if you are listening and you're wondering, okay, well, what's the starting point for the tier one? Those are kind of your big classroom five. So maximize structure, expectations, student engagement, acknowledging behavior, and responding to interfering behavior.
So then as we move into tier two, how does the science of behavior apply to that?
Data. We have to look at multiple pieces of data to figure out which students require or need that tier two level of support. Um, we also have to look at the fidelity of implementation for those tier one strategies and making sure that students have had access to all those wonderful things Daria just listed before we say this is a student specific issue and we need to move the student into something that's a little more individualized into that tier two realm, or this is some support that we can provide to the classroom teacher or whoever to help make sure that we're reaching fidelity, that the student's actually getting the interventions that we're talking about getting. And the same behavioral principles apply there when we're supporting teachers as in when we're supporting students. We set clear expectations. We find what's going to be reinforcing. We reinforce closer approximations of the targeted behavior, right? It's all kind of the same situation and manipulating and changing the environment in a way that makes those behaviors that are in line with the fidelity check or the things we're looking for, and making those expectations clear and reinforcing closer approximations.
Yeah, and I think to Daniel's point about data, we also need to make sure we are clear that we have decision rules around the data, right? So, what are our criteria for entry into accessing an intervention? And what is our exit criteria? Because when you have access to a tier two intervention, it should not mean that you have to participate in this intervention for the rest of your K through 12 experience, right? That we want to give the support that the students need at the time that they need it until they are able to be successful. And then when they no longer need it, they don't need to continue with it, partially because they don't need it, and partially because we can't just keep everyone in that tier two of triangle. And
And Daria,
so,
just to interject, like that's that idea of you don't have a tier two kid. You
right.
have a kid who has a need for a tier two intervention, but that need hopefully is temporary because as we build skills, as we, help the environment, whatever the case may be, that student can be the supports can be reduced back to that tier one level and they can still be successful.
Right. So the goal, right, is to help all kids become successful, independent, autonomous learners. And so the interventions are really intended to be temporarily until, as you say, they're able to pick up and demonstrate those skills. So I think a lot of times we are really good in schools about finding those data points and making decisions when do students and which students start an intervention, but I don't know that we always bookend it and also make the same clear rules as to, and how do we know when it's okay to pull back or, kind of graduate out of a tier two support.
And I think further defining kind of what it means to graduate out of or to be able to pull back from a tier two support, which is, I think, another point that I think you mentioned at the beginning. These are additional layers. This is an instead of, right? And so if a kid may have tier two needs in the social skills realm, and maybe they're getting lunch bunch, or they're in a small group of kids and they're doing social skills instruction, all the while they're also getting that social skills instruction with their class, whatever is happening with the rest of the school or that grade level. And so it's not a or, it's an and so over time, how do we fade that back? How do we sort of graduate them out, whether that's participating less often or participating more? I don't know. Like, but being able to define what that looks like for an individual, I think, is really part of that behavior analytic piece too, and saying, okay, this is going to be our data trigger to say, now it's time to start fading that back.
Yeah, and I think just to reiterate that point one more time of they don't lose access to the tier one supports and interventions. They gain access to tier two interventions while maintaining that access to tier one interventions. It's not instead of, it's in addition to.
Right. And in many depictions of the triangle, there are lots of different variations of an MTSS framework triangle. One of my personal ones is the one that labels all for tier one supports, some for tier two supports, and few for tier three supports. And I think those verbal cues of all, some, and few are really helpful in making sure that we remember that and piece that Daniel was talking about, right? That whether you are receiving a more intensified support in tier two or even a tier three, you're still part of all students. So you still are getting all of the tier one supports to fidelity as well.
All right, well, let's talk about tier three. So what happens in tier three?
Tier three is very individualized and it is as intensive as we can get in the school setting. So tier three is really, it's following a lot of the very similar principles, right? We're still looking at the data, we're still looking at the decision rules about entry and exit criteria, but our intervention itself is intensified to where it is based on individual student and it is very much in a again, individualized, intensified way.
Yeah, and I think the important point about tier three, a couple important points. One is that really individualized piece. When we get into tier two, we should definitely still be matching intervention to need or to function. But as we get into tier three, we need to understand that tier two intervention wasn't enough for the student to be successful. So we really have to look at what is the student's individual needs so that we can match our intervention to be very precise and very aligned with whatever that need may be so that we can provide that intensive instruction in order to support them to be successful.
And what that might mean in some instances is additional data being gathered about the student and that need. And so it can also trigger kind of some of the requirements that schools are required to follow as it relates to student data and getting permission to gather new data. And so it could be a trigger for that. I think, one of the most common examples is getting an FBA and a BIP, or an FBA that may trigger the need for a behavior intervention plan. And in order to do that, parental permission is required to get that level of support or that level of assessment, that individualized, because it's not something that every other student is necessarily having access to.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really good example of a tier three support. it's not the only tier three support by any means, but a functional behavior assessment is an individualized plan by definition. We're not doing that for a group of students or an entire classroom. We're doing that for one student to determine their function of their behavior for in this environment with this setting of, all those things, so that we can develop a very individualized plan, hence the term behavior intervention plan, but it is an individualized plan. It is not a group plan. And so how do we match those interventions to the function for that student in that context? Those kinds of pieces.
I think one of the challenges there, to kind of go back to tier one, is the further out from tier one we get, the the more I think we need to really be thoughtful about graduating out, right? Like, so if I've moved seamlessly through tier one, tier two, tier three, when we start putting together that intervention plan, we really have to keep in mind what is available, what's happening at tier one, so that there can be sort of that friendly handshake between tier three and tier two that's gradually stepping you back to tier one. And so using some of the same language, maybe some of the strategies are much more intensified as far as how frequently students are getting, or the students getting reinforced, or how the expectations are being communicated, or whatever else. Um, at the same time, being able to continue to connect as much as you can between that tier three intervention and the tier one, so that they're, again, it's an and, right? It's tier one and my behavior plan, or my very specially designed instruction that I'm receiving. Um, but being able to make sure that that connection remains, so that when it's time, we can start fading out those supports.
Yeah, I do think one other really important point here is sometimes I think there's a belief that tier three means special education, and it does not. Students receiving special education receive tier one, tier two, and tier three supports as needed for whatever their needs are. They also receive specially designed instruction to meet their unique needs based upon the needs from their disability. And so just a caveat to put in there, that special education is not automatically tier three. It just means that they receive specially designed instruction to meet the unique needs of their disability. Um, One of the other things I think is really important is I think sometimes systems are set up so that at certain points you can access individual or access additional resources, and that might be curricular resources, that might be technological resources, and it might also be personnel. So now you're in tier three, or you have a student that requires tier three interventions, so now you can access the school psychologist, the BCBA, the whatever the case may be. And I just want to emphasize it's really important that those folks are involved not just at the highest level of the tiers, that they're involved all the way through. Because otherwise, what happens is we do see this flipping of the triangle, and then we have tornadoes instead of triangles, which I think is such a great visual image, because all of a sudden, we don't have the great tier one supports in place that we may need. And so we're accessing higher levels of resources before we may actually need them because we didn't involve those people at those earlier tiers.
Well, and sometimes our own self-assessment is not, it's not quite matching up to what might be happening in the classroom, right? And so it's always a good idea to make sure that you have an opportunity to bring in the voice of someone who has behavioral knowledge and expertise across the different tiers. So sometimes it's really nice to have someone with expertise to walk around and take some data and walkthroughs on the tier one supports to make sure that while we think we are doing them to fidelity, that is actually what's happening, and for schools that are doing PBIS, they are familiar with the walkthrough tool, the tiered fidelity inventory, where my favorite part of that tool is when you stop 10 kiddos and you just ask them, hey, do you know about what are the expectations? Have you received any sort of reinforcement, right? And if we think we are doing everything to fidelity, but all the kids that we stopped have no idea what we are talking about, then there is a little bit of room for improvement, right? And so I think that we automatically jump to reaching out to folks with behavior expertise when we are looking at the tier three support, sometimes when we're looking at tier two support. But I believe it's really a missed opportunity not to include them along tier one to help maximize our systems and to make sure that the fidelity really is there and to provide their perspective on how to shape the adult behavior to make sure that we all are as consistent as we can be with those classroom management systems.
Yeah, and I think your point about students is really an important point. Students don't have to understand every intricacy of an MTSS or a PBIS system, but they should be understanding what the system essentially is. And I'll tell you, like from my own personal experience, one of my kids is in a school that has a PBIS system, and they'll come home and let me know that they got their positive behavior sticker for the day, which is fabulous, and they're very excited about it. And then I'll say, "Oh, what did you get that for?" And I get a lot of like, "Well, I don't know." Okay, so that's going to be an issue if you don't know why you're getting this, because how do you replicate that if you didn't know why you got it in the first place? And it's not to say that anyone at the school is doing a bad thing or a wrong thing. It's just not as explicit as it probably needs to be.
And I think that's a perhaps sometimes a common experience for some
I
of
think
our
it is.
kiddos, right? Because I think the adults are so focused on fidelity and they are making sure that they're doing, and in this case, the adults are doing what they should be doing. They are doing reinforcers, they are giving out their stickers and whatnot, right? It's just that tiny little tweak that having somebody else be able to look in from semi-outside perspective would be a quick little fix that could make the system so much stronger when the kids are seeing those connections.
Yeah, and to your point, in this case, I think the quick little fix is, hey, you did a great job with X, so I'm going to give you a positive behavior support sticker. And then the kid knows. It's something really minor and little, um, but it would make a difference.
I think that's the thing with particularly tier one supports. I think the devil really is in the details there, right? Because I think sometimes we think like, of course, we acknowledge the behavior that we want to see. But if we were to take data and look at the, well, at what ratio are you acknowledging this? Or are you acknowledging it really, or do you think you're acknowledging
Right.
it, right? I think it's all those little pieces of the whole that if we have an opportunity to look at each one and kind of, again, just make sure that it's working, then I think we could make a lot of great progress in schools.
All
And I
right.
think too, just thinking about your example, Selena, there's a continuum within it, right? Like we can look at the fidelity of implementation. We can look at, is behavior specific praise being implemented? Like, are we referencing the rule? Are we referencing or the expectation or the agreement that we've got, right? We're using that language. We're labeling the behavior that the student did to earn the thing. Um, and some kids don't need that. Like even within the same tier, some kids were just like, yeah, I'm just happy to be here. Thanks for the sticker, right? Like whatever you like, I'm here. I'm going to do the things. School, got it. Like that's what I'm here to do. And some might need not a tier two, but like the fidelity of tier one to sort of make that connection. As we think about tiered systems in schools, and we know that tier one and tier two and tier three exist, how do we address tier zero, i.e., the real world when they graduate? Like, how do we fade from tier one or shape tier one? And I know it looks different at high school. Is there anything written about that? I'm interested for me, and it's on my mind as I'm thinking because I think a lot of times, especially kids with IEPs, are over supported, especially as they move into transition years and they're starting to learn how to do life skills, but they're still just the essence of school over supports them, right? Like because they're told they have to be in certain places. All this, right? School itself is such a structured thing that even kids, typically developing kids, go to college and fail because they haven't developed sort of those executive functioning, planning, study, learning skills
Well, I
because
think
their
the
world has
behavior
been so
analytic,
structured.
sorry. I think the behavior analytic response is you have to change the stimulus control, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I don't know that we do that very well. So I think that this is a really great conversation, and MTSS is a really big topic. So this is really just part one of this conversation. We're going to pick this up and continue some more later. But before we leave our dear listeners, I do want to, as always, share a really good resource that we have. And so, Daria, I think you have our unpaid commercial for today.
I do. In fact, I'm so excited about MTSS resources that I will be sharing another one for the part two. But for the part one resource, we have the actual MTSS for Success website, which is a national hub of resources, all things. It's a center on multi-tiered system of supports, and it comes to us from the American Institute for Research. And on this website, you can find articles, you can find resources to help with implementation, you can read more about the essential components of what MTSS is. And I'm a big fan of that site just because you can fall down many learning rabbit hole on that website and find something that is meaningful for you and your context.
Well, with that, thank you, everybody. Daniel, Daria, pleasure.
Always a pleasure.
Emily, thank you for all of your help.
My pleasure.
And we will see our listeners on our next episode.
Thanks for listening to Education Insights Focus on Behavior. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can join the conversation by emailing us at cbis@odu.edu, visiting www.cbisva.org, or following us on Facebook, Instagram, X, or Blue Sky at CBISVA. Special thanks to the Virginia Department of Education for their support of this project.